Hi folks, I'm Jem, the Crazy Pigeon Lady, and this is Anna, my pet fancy pigeon. Welcome back to my series, Pigeons as Pets, where I'm sharing my beginner's guide to keeping pigeons as pets. In my previous episode, episode 1, I talked about why pigeons make good pets and are they right for you. In this episode, episode 2, I'll be talking about how to choose and acquire a pigeon. First of all, it's important to point out that I'm talking here about mainly the domesticated pigeons, so the domesticated version of the species Columba livia, although much of the advice I give here will also be relevant to other columbid species that are commonly kept as pets as well, things like small doves, like zebra doves or diamond doves or ring doves. So when thinking about choosing and acquiring a pigeon, one of the first things you should think about is whether to shop or adopt. That is to say, whether to buy a pigeon from a breeder or whether to adopt a pigeon from a rescue. And there are both advantages and disadvantages for both. And either is potentially a good option for you, depending on how you feel about those advantages and disadvantages. So first of all, let's talk about buying from a breeder. So when you buy from a breeder, you are buying from a person who has specifically bred that bird. So they might have bred that bird as a racing pigeon, they might have bred that bird as a fancy pigeon. Some of the advantages to buying from a breeder is that as a pet owner, you are giving a home to someone's excess stock birds that might otherwise have an uncertain future. So people who breed racing pigeons and people who breed fancy pigeons will always have excess birds that don't necessarily meet their needs. Either they're not suitable for show or for breeding other show birds, or they're not suitable for racing or breeding other racing birds. And depending upon the fancier, the fates of these birds can sometimes be uncertain. And so by buying from an excess stock from a breeder, you are ensuring that that bird will receive a loving home. When you buy from a breeder, the chances are that you will have access to a greater choice and variety of potential breeds than you would get access to if you were trying to get one from a rescue. So if you are after a specific kind of pigeon and a specific kind of breed, then you're more likely to find that from a breeder than you are from a rescue centre. Also, the breeder themselves is likely to be much more knowledgeable about the specific bird that you are looking to acquire, particularly if you're after a particular breed. And whilst rescues are generally very experienced and know a lot about pigeons, they don't always have specialist knowledge about the particular breeds in question. So if that's something that you're looking for, then that's something that a more likely a breeder is going to have, is that specialist knowledge. And they might even be willing to give you ongoing or advice or support to a certain degree in order to help you get started. Also, if you buy from a breeder, that you'll have the opportunity or a greater scope to get access to young birds. So if you're looking to acquire a very young bird, one that is more likely to become tame and very handleable because you acquired it when it was young, you're more likely to be able to get that from a breeder than you are necessarily from a rescue if you're specifically looking to get a young juvenile bird. But like anything, of course, there are some disadvantages to buying from a breeder also. Unlike a rescue, you're probably likely to have to pay for the birds. Now, as I mentioned in the previous episode, in episode 1, pigeons aren't particularly expensive. So unlike parrots or parakeets, where you're going to have to spend quite a lot of money in order to acquire a bird, pigeons generally aren't very expensive, and so it's not going to be a huge cost outlay, but there will be a cost involved in buying from a breeder, which may be less so if you were getting one from a rescue. Also, if you are buying from a breeder, then that is a rescue bird that's not getting a new home. And therefore, if it's important to you to be able to support your local rescues, then please do go to your rescues to get those birds, because by buying from a breeder, you are effectively participating in the process of there being more pigeons brought in the world, whilst there are lots of other pigeons that are also looking for homes. So if there's something that's important to you, maybe you should consider getting a pigeon from a rescue rather than from a breeder. Also, the breeder, when they're breeding the birds, is going to breed quite a lot of these birds, and therefore, whilst they may be knowledgeable about the breed and the birds in general, they may not be knowledgeable about the specific individual that you want to buy. Whereas if you went to a rescue, they're more likely to have got to know that bird as an individual and therefore have a degree of knowledge about their temperament or character, which is something that would almost certainly be of interest to you if you are looking to get one as a pet. Whereas a breeder, then birds are more like, I suppose, livestock, if you like, and therefore they don't necessarily have a personal relationship with each bird, and therefore are not always able to tell you about the specific character or temperament of the individual bird that you might want to buy. So that's the advantages and disadvantages of buying a breed from a breeder. So let's talk about getting a bird from a rescue. So as I mentioned before, by getting a bird from a rescue, you are providing a bird with a home that currently doesn't have one. And some birds in rescues have had a pretty tough life. They've been abandoned, or they've been sick, or they've been injured. And rescues don't have unlimited space in which to hold these birds on a long-term or a forever basis. So by acquiring a bird from a rescue, not only are you helping that individual bird by providing them with a loving home for the rest of their lives, you're also helping out the rescue too, which is great for them. Possibly the birds are likely to be free of charge or possibly very low cost. Many rescues will ask if you will provide them with a donation or pay an adoption fee, and this will go towards the cost of having kept the bird in the first place, and will be put towards the future costs of helping to rescue other birds too. Or indeed, if you're not asked to pay for any fee at all, it may just cost you the cost of the travel expenses in order to get to the rescue, and therefore it's likely to be less expensive than perhaps if you bought from a breeder. Also, as I mentioned in buying from breeders as well, the rescue is more likely to have built a relationship with the individual bird that you want to buy and will be able to answer your questions about their temperament or character, which is something you should definitely talk to them about if you're looking to get a bird as a pet. There are some disadvantages though for getting a bird from a rescue, although there aren't many. The chances are that there'll be less choice of birds. So if you were looking to acquire a specific kind of bird or a specific kind of breed, then it will probably be hard to find one of those in a rescue. Also, rescues tend to deal with more wild birds and feral birds, much less so fancy birds. So if you were looking for something particularly cute or pretty or attractive looking, then there might be less choice of birds in that area than if you bought one from a breeder. Also, whilst rescues are very knowledgeable and experienced about pigeons, they may not necessarily have specialist knowledge about the particular breed or type of bird that you're buying, which is something, of course, that a breeder would have. And so, again, if you were looking to acquire a specific breed and wanted to know more about their particular care requirements, then the knowledge isn't necessarily going to be there at the rescue, unless they happen to have had experience of dealing with that breed before. Also, many birds at rescues have ongoing health conditions or disabilities. So if you have never had a pigeon before and don't have any experience in looking after pigeons, then taking on a bird with more complex health needs and disabilities is perhaps not something you should attempt as a beginner. However, if you are a little more experienced in keeping pigeons and you feel confident, then speak to the rescue about the possibility of adopting a disabled bird, because they absolutely need loving homes just as much as birds that aren't disabled. And if you're prepared to put in that little bit of extra time and that little bit of extra effort, rehoming a disabled bird and giving them a loving home can be a very rewarding experience. If you get a bird from a rescue, you're also likely to have to answer a number of questions or possibly complete some adoption forms that will ask you about things like your experience and perhaps the environment you intend to keep them and the equipment that you have. But if you have done your research and you are determined to get a pigeon, and if you've put the right things in place, there shouldn't really be any difficulty or problem in order with you answering their questions. They're just trying to satisfy themselves that the person that they're giving the bird that they have rescued to has the ability to be able to look after this bird properly. And so it's only fair that they make sure that they're giving their birds to the right people. So that's the advantages and disadvantages of choosing to either buy from a breeder or acquire from a rescue. And that's something you should think about when you're thinking about acquiring a pigeon. The next thing you should think about, other than where to acquire the pigeon from, is what kind of pigeon do you want to acquire? Now, there's lots of different sorts of pigeons out there that have slightly different needs and slightly different temperaments. And to a certain degree, you'll need to think back to some of the things that I encouraged you to consider in episode 1. About determining whether a pigeon was right for you, because the choice of pigeon that you make here will be directly related to what it is that you have to offer in terms of your space, your time, your experience, and what sort of environment. So there's a number of different options here. There are fancy pigeons, racing pigeons or flying breeds of pigeons, so things like tumblers and rollers. There are utility pigeons, so these are pigeons that have come from commercial meat production environments, or rescue pigeons, which could be feral birds, could be wild birds, could also include disabled birds. So when it comes to fancy pigeons, there's a huge amount of variety of fancy pigeons, hundreds of different breeds worldwide, and they're incredibly variable when it comes to sizes, shapes, colours and temperaments. And some of them are more suited to an outdoor environment, and they would be better off living in an aviary or loft out of doors. Some of them are much more well adapted for being in a home environment and being pets, the Lahore breed of pigeon being one. So if you're looking to acquire a fancy pigeon, it's important to understand the different types of breeds that you might be interested in and whether they are well suited to an indoor or outdoor environment and what sort of temperament they have. Some of them are very peaceful and very placid in nature and therefore make very easygoing pets. Some of them have much more specialist needs. So, for example, things like the pouting or the blowing breeds, where they inflate their crops to a huge degree, have quite specialist feeding requirements and can suffer from certain health conditions related to their extra inflated crop, and therefore that requires a little bit more specialism and experience. So that is something you need to think about when you're thinking about getting a fancy pigeon, is choosing the right breed for your experience and what you can offer. Next up, you have racing and flying pigeons. So the racing pigeons are the athletes of the pigeon world. They are strong, they're fast, they have endurance, they're used to having training and exercise. Similarly, flying breeds, tumblers and rollers, again, they're used to being trained and having exercise and going out of doors. Therefore, if you're looking for a bird to be an indoor pet, you need to consider whether it's right or appropriate to keep a bird that's very much used to training and exercise in an indoor environment. And having a bird of that kind, unless it's disabled or perhaps it's elderly and you're looking to pick it up for its retirement, it might be more appropriate to keep those birds in an outdoor environment, in an aviary, where they're able to get fresh air and exercise. Next, utility pigeons. So these are large breeds of pigeons which have come from commercial pigeon meat squab rearing environments. This is not necessarily an option in every country, depending on where you come from. Here in the UK, there's no real demand for a huge amount of commercial squab production. Most pigeon eaten in this country is actually wild bird shot as game. But certainly if you live in the United States, pigeon is usually commercially reared squab, and sometimes commercial breeding pigeons can become available for adoption, which otherwise might have an uncertain fate. Things like the king pigeon, for example, which also have a reputation of making good pets. So this is something that's also potentially something you can consider. Finally, rescue pigeons, of course, which I talked about in the advantages and disadvantages, and these can be a mixed bag of different sorts of birds. They might be feral birds that have come from a town or a city. There might be lost racers, lost fancies. It might include elderly birds, might also include disabled birds. So if you're quite flexible about what kind of bird that you're looking for, then this may be an option for you. And again, you need to consider how you can best meet their needs and what sort of environment and capabilities and experience that you have, and whether that is suited to the kind of bird that you're potentially considering getting from a rescue. But whatever your experience, whatever your environment that you can offer and your equipment, you can generally find some sort of pigeon that would be suited to that environment. And in order to give them the best and healthiest and most loving home possible, it's important to choose the right kind of pigeon for what it is that you can offer. The next thing to consider after thinking about what sort of pigeon you want to acquire is whether you want to acquire a pigeon that's a single bird or whether you want to acquire a pair. Now, if you acquire a single bird, it's very important to remember that pigeons are a social species, and in order for them to function healthily, they require social contact. And so if you're going to get a lone bird, you're going to need to build a very close relationship with that bird through lots of social contact, and undertake a certain amount of research into what you need to do and understanding pigeon behaviour and what pigeons need socially, because you are providing the sole social relationship for that bird if you keep that bird on its own. Now, it's not impossible to keep a lone bird on its own for that bird to be healthy and happy, but it is quite a big responsibility, and therefore you need to ensure that you have the time and that you're prepared to put in the effort and do the work in order to ensure that that remains the case. If, however, you are unable to provide the level of social contact that an individual bird might need, then it might be better for you to acquire a pair, in which case these birds have each other in order to bond and to have a relationship and to have company, and therefore it will require less input from you in order to meet those birds' social needs. And certainly if you have an aviary out of doors, you have the opportunity to have an even bigger group of birds as well. As I mentioned in episode 1, if you're acquiring a pair of birds, what will come with that, especially if the birds are the opposite gender, is the need to manage their breeding. And I will talk about this in a later episode when I talk about managing breeding. And so, as I mentioned in episode 1, this is something you need to give us some thought to as to whether you have the time to manage that. So having given some thought about where you want to acquire your bird from and what sort and how many, you need to get yourself ready before you go and actually physically get the bird and bring them to your home. So you need to make sure that you've done your research, that you understand what bird it is that you're looking for and whether you can meet its needs and whether it can meet yours. Talk to the breeder or talk to the rescue in advance, ask them all the questions that you want to ask them. It's very important that you understand what it is that you're getting yourself into, and that you find out exactly everything you can about the birds. Make sure before you go and collect any bird that you have the equipment ready that you need. So you have appropriate housing to put them in. So you have the aviary, or you have the cage, or you have the loft available to put that bird in when you go back. And that you have the minimum basic equipment that you need in order to feed that bird. So you've got food, you've got the dishes, you've got a few basics in place, so that as soon as you get that bird home, they've got somewhere to go to and you've got the food to keep them going. And you shouldn't rush out to acquire the bird until all these things are in place and set up. And I'll talk more about housing and equipment in episode 3, and in episode 4 I'll talk about feeding and nutrition and some of the basics that you need there. Also, before you go and collect the bird, you need an appropriate carry box. There's a number of different sorts of these available. It could be a small pet carrier, like a cat carrier that you've put a towel inside, something for the bird to grip onto and feel more secure. Some inside the box it will be dark, which will help to keep the bird calm. Also, if you're travelling in a vehicle, you need to make sure that that carrier is secured in the vehicle, so it's not going to fall over or turn over or get knocked, so that you arrive at the rescue or at the breeder ready and prepared to bring the bird home safely. When you go to collect the bird, the chances are that you'll be getting quite excited at this point, and therefore it's really important to try and keep a level head, to make sure that you ask all of the right questions and do all the right things, to make sure that when you actually pick up this bird and take it home, that you're not picking it up and taking it home with any issues that you're going to have to deal with later. So it's very important to try to overcome that excitement and keep a cool head, and remember the few things that you need to bear in mind when you're there, and perhaps even write yourself a little note or a little list to help keep you on track. First of all, I would encourage you to check out the environment in which the bird is being kept. So ask the breeder or ask the rescue to show you around, and have a look around at the environment. You know, does it seem clean? Does it seem well kept? You know, does it seem overcrowded? Do the birds generally seem in good condition? All of these sorts of things point towards how well the birds have been cared for, and therefore it's important to pay attention to that, to give yourself an overall impression as to whether the bird you are about to acquire has been well looked after. Next, talk to the breeder, talk to the rescue, ask questions about the bird. So some of the things that you might want to ask is, you know, how old the bird is, you know, how long they've had it, its history, perhaps any prior health issues it might have had, anything you can think of really to help to understand, you know, what you need to know about this bird that you're going to acquire is. And hopefully a reputable breeder and certainly a reputable rescue should be more than happy to answer any questions that you have in this area. Next, after asking questions, it's very important for you to actually handle the bird as well, to actually get it in your hands and to give it a good examination. You want to make sure that the bird you're acquiring is healthy and that you're not taking it home with untreated disease or serious health conditions that you're going to have to deal with, or potentially could be passed on to your other birds if you already have some at home. Some of the things you might want to check for is looking at the eyes. Are they clear? Are they bright? You know, there's no swelling or redness or cloudiness over the eyes. You want to look, open the beak and look inside the mouth. Make sure it's a good colour, make sure it's clear, make sure that there's no sort of deposits or growths or anything on the tongue or inside of the throat. Check the nostrils, make sure they're clear, make sure they're not running with fluid or anything like that. Does the bird breathe freely? You know, it's not making any wheezing sounds or anything like that. Have a look over its beak and claws, check to make sure the beak's not overgrown or crossed, that the claws are also not overgrown or have any issues there either. Check the feather conditions, so open out the wings and tail, give them a really good look, make sure that there's no signs of any lice or mites. You particularly want to check areas like sort of under the armpit type area, or under the tail around the vent area. Check that the vent area is clean and the feathers are not stained, to indicate that the bird might have had a problem with pooping. So you're looking for all that sort of thing too, as well as the presence of any parasites within the feathers. If you can, get a look at the bird's individual cage area and poops. Do they look a good sort of colour? You know, they should be sort of round and firm and kind of brownish with a little white on the top. They shouldn't be liquid, they shouldn't be green, they shouldn't smell bad. So that is something also to look for. Another thing you might want to ask as well, once you've had the bird look over, is whether or not the bird has been sexed. So if you were particular about getting a bird that's a male or a female, you may want to ask if the bird has been sexed. The one thing I would say is to exercise caution here, because the only absolute way to be certain of the gender of a pigeon is either to perform a DNA test on a feather sample, which sometimes a rescue or breeder will do, or if the bird has proven to have laid an egg and therefore which is certain to be a hen. There are lots and lots of different ways to get clues about the gender of a pigeon, things like the shape of their head, their behaviour, maybe something about the lengths of the toes and things like that. But none of these things can be 100% reliable, and therefore if you are absolutely certain that you want a specific gender of pigeon, then you need to make sure that irrefutable evidence has been provided to that. Otherwise you could find that once you get the bird home that it isn't necessarily the gender that you thought it was. Also, finally, you want to ask the rescue or breeder about what sort of vaccinations or medications that the bird might have received prior to your visit. Once you get the bird home, you initially want to acclimatise it. And I recommend that you go slowly with this. It's important. They've just come from a very different place. They've experienced a lot of change, and birds can get quite stressed. Therefore, it's important once you get the bird home not to overwhelm them initially with too much contact. So put them in their cage, put them in their home, make sure that there's food or water there, and for as long as you can, just leave them alone. Keep a relaxed environment, keep it quiet, and let them settle into their new environment and just observe them. Keep everything calm. Don't push to handle the birds too much if you can possibly avoid it at this stage. If you have other birds in particular, I recommend that you keep them isolated for at least 1 week from other birds, just to make sure that they're not showing any signs or symptoms of any disease before you allow them to have contact with your other birds. Keep an eye on their health, and you may actually want to take the bird to the vet during that first week just to give them a general health checkup, take their weight and give them a good look over. Give it a few days and some time to establish a general routine. Make sure that you talk to the bird a lot so that it starts to recognise the sound of your voice. And it's important to make sure that from the get-go, as much as possible, you are associating yourself with positive things like food and social contact. I'll talk a little bit more in episode 6 about building a relationship with your bird and understanding their behaviour. But the most important things right now are to focus on keeping that calm environment, making sure that they associate you with positive things and not putting them under too much pressure initially that might make them anxious and fearful. So, in summary, I've talked about all the things you need to think about when choosing and acquiring a pigeon, from whether you should shop, acquire from a breeder, or adopt, acquire from a rescue. Things you need to consider about what sort of pigeon that you might want to acquire based on yours and their needs, whether you should get a single bird or a pair, how you get ready, what you should do once you get there, the questions you should ask, and what sort of things you should look out for in the specific bird that you're about to buy, and a little bit about how you get them acclimatized once you get them home. I hope that's been of useful to you. A lot has been covered there. If you like this video and you think that there's someone else who could benefit from it, please keep liking and sharing. Thank you for supporting my page, and I look forward to seeing you back again in episode 3, where I talk about housing for pigeons, and I'll see you next time. From me and Anna, goodbye.